Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Office 365, The Unseen Legal Concerns. RVM is very proud to host this webinar today and to have industry experts involved that can walk us through a lot of the questions that we see from a day-to-day basis with Office 365. To introduce myself, my name is Sean King, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at RVM Incorporated. I've been advising clients on information governance obligations and solutions, discovery responses and options, and general legal technology for almost 20 years. I have worked at law firms and service providers like RVM during that time and have supported a wide variety of clients in a wide variety of litigations, investigations, and compliance issues. Today, I will be moderating the panel of experts that will be able to discuss more about the specific questions and trends we are seeing with Office 365. So, to introduce our panel today, we have Alan Johnson, who is a founding partner of Actium LLP, a business litigation boutique firm in Los Angeles, California. Before founding Actium, Alan was senior attorney at the law department at Southern California Edison in Rosemead, California. In addition to representing Southern California Edison in commercial litigation matters and regulatory proceedings before the California Public Utilities Commission, Alan served as Southern California Edison's e-discovery task force, providing consultation on matters involving electronic discovery. Alan has extensive experience with developing e-discovery workflows in Office 365 and has consulted with companies on best practices for handling information governance and e-discovery matters when implementing Office 365. Alan is a frequent speaker at conferences and webinars regarding O365 and other e-discovery topics. Greg Kinsella is our Director of Forensics at RVM. Greg oversees our efforts related to preservation, identification, extraction, documentation, and interpretation of digital data as a service to our clients. As a certified forensic engineer, he has performed countless digital forensic investigations since 2003 and frequently counsels clients on and performs data extractions from Office 365. Greg has been recognized multiple times by the New York Law Journal Reader Rankings as Best Expert Witness in Technology, including the most recent ranking year of 2017. As well, we have Ken Oliver from the Oliver Group, an RVM company, joining us with over 15 years experience in e-discovery and has extensive background in data forensics and enterprise systems. Ken has managed forensic, global data acquisition, and collection engagements in over 50 countries on some of the largest and most highly publicized litigation cases around the world. He is a Microsoft certified professional since 1999, and Ken has been trained in Microsoft Office 365 e-discovery and data governance. Through his career, Ken has performed thousands of email-related discovery quests. Thank you to the panel for joining us today. We have all seen the news in the last few months of how the technology we rely on so frequently may not be as positive as we believed. We have seen concerns raised with technologies like Amazon Alexa recording conversations, Facebook's failure to secure personal information, potential harm with driverless cars, various cybersecurity breaches, etc. But despite all of these newly raised concerns, we all know that this is the trend of the future. There does not seem to be a pause or slowdown button we can engage, and we all will need to adjust to the changing technology and times. Office 365 is an example of the trend in technology that is changing the way we operate. But is it all positive and rosy? Have we educated ourselves enough to understand and harness the power that a solution like Office 365 or any cloud-based email and data management solution offers? Office 365 is the largest technology implementation and trend happening in corporate America today. And yet most users and most stakeholders of the solution do not even realize it's being implemented, the options it offers, and how it impacts business processes including the legal processes that all of us manage on a day-to-day basis? And beyond that, have we actually properly discussed what its actual legal impact is or could be? Our panel today has advised clients and assisted clients on using Office 365 for data searching, data collection, and using it as an investigative tool. As well, some of the members of the panel have helped oversee or been involved with implementing Office 365 and addressing the challenges that have come with using it for legal needs. Today, we are going to walk through why Office 365 or other cloud-based email systems are being implemented and what seems to be happening in that implementation process that impacts lawyers and the legal work that occurs. We will then move through some of the trends we have seen with using Office 365 for legal holds, data searching, collection, and investigation purposes. We will discuss some legal questions that might face data collection from Office 365 in the future. And finally, we will outline some quick takeaways that all users of Office 365 or any cloud-based email management system should walk away with from this presentation. And so I'd like to move on to the first topic and ask, Ken Oliver, what does Office 365 actually do?
Great, thank you, Sean, and welcome everyone. Office 365 is the brand name Microsoft uses for subscription services they offer in the cloud. In the past, when you bought Microsoft products, you bought them individually, installed them on your computer individually. You owned the license and could use it for as long as you wanted or needed for that version. Today, Microsoft offers a cloud-based solution that is more of a subscription model, i.e. annual recurring fee for use. The subscription service allows you to tie together a lot of applications for seamless use. So if you've bought into Office 365, you might use Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and email all licensed together. As an end user, it looks the same. The difference is where the information is stored. An example, in the cloud or on a server you might own. How your licensing or subscription works. With Office 365, you don't have to really worry about updating or upgrading your version of the tool. As part of the subscription service, Microsoft does that for you over time. As well, Microsoft continues to invest and make available other applications with Office 365 like SharePoint and Skype, and is starting to integrate with non-standard Office products like Yammer. It should be known that the data for some of these applications may not actually be on physical servers you own or can control. Your data like email may be in the cloud that is being hosted or supported by Microsoft itself. While your functionality may be greater, how you access and control your data may be different. And the questions of all of you should ask yourself is, do I know how it is different? Some other questions, how does Office 365 support e-discovery? Office 365 has a host of built-in e-discovery tools and provides a comprehensive tool set to facilitate many facets of the e-discovery lifecycle. From legal holds through the searching and production of data, Microsoft has developed capabilities through their Security and Compliance Center and advanced e-discovery features that allow for legal holds, searching, exporting, and advanced analytics, including predictive coding, email threading, and near duplicates. These are functions that traditionally Microsoft Outlook or other Microsoft tools not part of Office 365 did not have. And if they were built into it, a company would have had to purchase new licensing and done installs on computers or servers and manage that through different processes. With Office 365, this functionality is all added behind the scenes by Microsoft with little effort by the business, but still can be administered locally by the company's IT group. Some things that you might want to consider when working with the built-in e-discovery processes are having a clear understanding whether or not your local IT groups or the companies you're working with as IT groups have the expertise with the platform, knowing that somewhere down the line that they may have to testify to the process. you might want to understand, does the organization have the right Office 365 support plan required for the e-discovery specifications, as each tier that Microsoft offers might offer a different set of capabilities. Another one might be, does the searching and exporting of data align with the upstream process outside of the Microsoft environment? When considering the use of these built-in features, some nuanced limitations exist that should be understood to ensure compliance with any legal obligations. Currently, according to Microsoft, more than half of all commercial business Office users are using Office 365 rather than standalone perpetual Office. And at some point in the company's fiscal 2019, which kicks off in July 1st, 2018, Microsoft is expecting 2/3 of its business Office customers to be using Office 365. Alan, can you explain why customers are moving to Office 365?
Yes, thank you. So, for all the reasons that Ken just said, it's a very attractive option for companies to be switching to Office 365. And the other piece of it, beyond the functionality that he described, is Microsoft has made it incredibly attractive from a cost perspective. And in my experience, the decision to switch to Office 365 is largely driven by IT departments and CIOs who are looking for an easy win, an easy way to cut a lot of costs in their operations. When you're managing your own Exchange servers and file shares and everything else, you have to maintain servers on premises. That costs money in terms of electricity bills and upkeep and upgrades, and a lot of times you have many people on payroll in IT managing those servers for you and the functionality. Microsoft has now given companies the option to outsource all of that, and at a much lower cost, with, in many cases, greater functionality than the company can provide to their employees without switching to Office 365. And it becomes, in my experience, kind of a no-brainer. And most of the companies I've spoken to, the IT department, analyzes this and decides this is what we should do, and they run it up the chain. But typically, information governance and the records retention type folks in the company, and the law department, people that are concerned with maintaining records and data in sort of a uniform way and in a way consistent with existing company policy, they are usually the last to the table. And often Office 365 is being implemented before anybody in the law department or information governance is even aware of it. And so part of my message today is if you are aware that your company is considering Office 365 or are already moving toward it, and you're in the law department or in some information governance role, you need to invite yourself and insert yourself into the discussions for the planning of the implementation. Office 365 is an amazing tool, but like anything else, it needs to be analyzed and considered and adopted for your particular company. Taking it straight off the shelf and putting it in place with all the sort of default settings that come with it is probably not going to be the right thing for your company. You need to look at all those settings and make sure that IT is engaged in a dialogue with the law department and information governance on what the appropriate settings and limits and controls are going to be. And make sure that your processes, besides just the settings, but that you're going to have the right processes in place and personnel in place to make this all work for you. And with that, I'll transition to the next slide.
So that all sounds great, but I guess the question is, what's the problem then? Why are we having this conversation? Greg, can you answer that?
Sure. So who's involved in the decision-making process to move to Office 365? One of the main things we hear from our customers is that their legal department is not fully involved in the decision to implement Office 365, and they do not get the opportunity to vet or weigh in on the impacts Office 365 might have on legal. This includes the abilities to implement legal holds. Who can implement those legal holds now? How quickly can those legal holds be implemented? Searching data. What are the options for searching within Office 365 as compared to searching within standard e-discovery tools that we're all accustomed to? Accessing that data. How does legal get access to that data? The export process within the data. What's involved in exporting it? What are the time constraints involved in those exports? Is it something that can be done rather quickly, or is it things that may take time to do that we're not used to? Responding to a subpoena or a document request is not really the best time to learn and understand your Office 365 environment. Yet that happens a lot more often than we would think. Many times we're asked to advise on how to best perform a function, but the function like exporting may take time, and many clients are not used to the extended period of time it may take to get data out of Office 365. Now, most clients that we work with nowadays, they're used to the on-prem solutions where data exports typically happened a lot more quickly, rapidly, within an hour or two. Time is one thing you lack when responding to a subpoena or a discovery request. Legal is also many times unaware of potential risks, like unindexed items, which anybody who's worked in Office 365, I'm sure, is familiar with. Inconsistent search results. Search results, you apply a search term, you may get back one thing now, and you do it again in an hour and may get back something totally different. What then ends up happening is that they're left scrambling to try and make a system achieve a certain result. This tends to cost extra in legal and consulting costs. One of the things we often ask is, right up front, what license version are you working off of in Office 365? Rarely does anybody on the legal team even know that. As a result of not knowing, they do not realize the functionality they have. If they're on an E5 license versus an E3 license package, for example, functionality obviously differs. Nor do they understand their opportunities to upgrade licenses for individuals should they need specific functionality within Office 365. Again, not understanding how a main system like email works adds more time to the collection process and makes exposing a client to risks of not collecting data properly or thoroughly enough. Imagine a scenario where you roll out Office 365 for operational cost reduction purposes, reduce your IT footprint, and now need to search and collect data from your IT system. Traditionally, your IT department might have handled some of that. Who does that now? We have seen several clients involve technical paralegals or other employees to run searches and get data out. And then the minute they run into an issue or a question, they call us to help guide them through to do it. In the end, I'm not sure if corporate legal, when implementing Office 365, realized that outsourcing was going to be the result of an important business decision. Ken, are you able to now walk us through some of the other concerns besides email?
Sure, thanks, Greg. Yeah, so is email the only thing I need to be thinking about when dealing with Office 365? And obviously the answer to that is going to be no. The beauty of Microsoft's cloud-based solution is that it integrates a lot of Microsoft's technology and other supportive applications and is integrated with Office 365. But again, as Greg mentioned before, legal teams rarely understand the functionality that Office 365 offers. Common questions we ask and don't always have the answers to include, what is the retention policy you have for email data or other data sources? Did you have legacy email data, something that might include Lotus Notes, for example, and what did you do with that data in the process of the term of the email rollouts? Is it integrated into Office 365, or is it sitting on another server somewhere? Is it powered off, sitting on a server, in a closet at another location? Where are your file share servers located, or SharePoint? Are they integrated with Office 365? Note that when collecting email from Office 365 that also have SharePoint on Office 365, there might be some challenges with attachments. A lot of times emails with referenced attachments as links to a cloud-based SharePoint solution might not always come over, or there might be a separate process that needs to be run. So does legal have a plan to address issues like this? Some other things are, how are you dealing with other email archive solutions? We've seen challenges where clients implement emails into Office 365 but never unarchived email from a previous platform. So when the email was imported, they imported stubs instead of the actual emails and attachments without realizing it. Another issue is to really understand where the data is physically located, as with, GDPR rolling out in the next, short period of time, there are issues with, where the data is located in what country. So that might be a consideration and understanding, for data privacy concerns in production. But at the end of the day, there are many great advantages Office 365 offers with its integration functionality. But if legal doesn't fully understand all it does and how it impacts information governance, you'll have a scenario of garbage in, garbage out. Legal must make sure that they are part of the conversation when assessing and implementing Office 365. Now, Alan, I know that you've worked through some of the adoption processes. Can you give us your thoughts on issues pertaining to this topic?
Yes. So ideally, IT will bring in people from the law department and the e-discovery function, whoever kind of performs that function, along with people from information governance or whoever is sort of responsible for determining the policies of how data and records will be stored for the company and for how long, and talk through what the different options are for migrating legacy data, for example, into Office 365. I view implementing something like Office 365, and whether it's this particular product or some other cloud-based product that comes along from another company someday that provides similar functionality, it's an opportunity for the company to look at what's in their garage and look at what's in their attic and in their storage units, if you will. It's like buying a new house and moving from your old house to a new house. It presents an opportunity for you to look at what you have, and do you still want to keep all the items in your closet, for example? Do you want to keep all of that and move them to the new house, or do you want to donate some of them and get rid of some of that? And companies need to take this as an opportunity to have this discussion, because it's probably not going to come up another time unless you're very good about keeping on top of your sort of record cleanup days and things like that. So have a discussion. What should we do with all the old data that's in file shares, and we can't even identify who the owners of these file shares are anymore? You should make some tough decisions about drawing lines and what you want to keep and what you don't want to keep and why. And then second, seriously consider for the stuff that you are going to keep, consider, is there a good way and an easy way for you to move it into Office 365? Can you take the file share data and move it into SharePoint and decommission the file shares? Can you take your old email archives and convert them all into a way that you can get them into people's Office 365 Outlook mailboxes? I would recommend that you not allow anyone in the company to sort of let the implementation of Office 365 result in just one more of many locations that the law department has to search for e-discovery, that the law department has to implement legal holds and preservation on, that the information governance department has to worry about keeping up with records retention. Don't let it be just another place that people stick stuff. Make it be the place. The more that you can get your information consolidated and centralized into Office 365, the more your company will be able to take advantage of all the features that Office 365 offers. And so I really recommend that you do that, because otherwise you're just going to be implementing holds in many different places and collections in many different places. The second thing I would say that's really important in sort of these implementation meetings that I recommend that law and legal and IG have, I think of those three departments as sort of three legs of a stool, and they all need to be a part of these discussions. Review all the settings that are available that relate to records retention in Office 365. And one example I can give that most people can relate to is a lot of companies have an auto-delete policy in their email. Email might be kept for 90 days or 180 days or a year or 2 years, whatever it is. Well, out of the box, Office 365 allows you to have an infinite period of time that email is kept in inboxes. Microsoft does not enforce any auto deletes out of the box for any part of the mailbox, which for a lot of companies might be great. Maybe that's what they want. And other companies might think, no, that we don't really want that. We want an auto delete. I recommend that you look at those settings and make conscious decisions that are consistent with your company's existing records retention policies, and then make those changes to those settings. If you allow any of the settings in Office 365 to remain in default status, you should be aware that Microsoft at any time could choose to change what that default setting is. One of my clients, after they implemented Office 365, they were of the understanding that Microsoft had a 60-day auto delete for trash in email. And that was the out-of-the-box default setting when this company implemented Office 365. Well, several months after it was implemented, Microsoft decided to change its default setting for trash. And they changed it from 60 days to infinity. In other words, there's no auto delete anymore in trash. Well, this particular company had never made the conscious effort to change the setting from default. So whenever Microsoft decides to change what the default is, it just rolls out to everybody. And they do announce these changes in their various materials, but if you don't have somebody paying very close attention to these updates, your records retention decisions could sort of get made for you. So I recommend that you go through those settings and make conscious decisions. So next slide, please.
Alan, this is Sean. As we're
Yeah.
sort of moving into the next slide, maybe just a quick follow-up question. So how do you see, whose responsibility is it on the record retention policy? Is that, obviously Office 365 seems to be decided by either CIOs or IT directors, but it obviously has real implications with things like records retention practices. What would be the takeaway as to who should be responsible for knowing that information? Is that, do you see that as legal or an IT role and function?
Usually it should be legal and whoever is responsible for whatever your company calls information governance. And that sometimes is housed within the law department. Sometimes it's a separate department. But there's usually someone responsible within the company for owning the policies on records retention and these kinds of decisions. That person or that team, along with legal, and when I say legal, specifically, I mean the people responsible for e-discovery and implementing legal holds. Typically, there's a function within the law department that does that. Somebody who is involved in that process needs to be at the table.
Thank you.
And as I was just mentioning, for implementing legal holds, one really nice thing about Office 365 is it gives an opportunity for the law department to do preservation in place. And what I mean by that, for people who are not too familiar with it, in the olden days of e-discovery, when everything was stored on individual people's computers, hard drives, and even servers, often the only way you could truly implement a preservation plan was to go out and copy that data. And you would copy it all, even if you hadn't gotten any discovery requests yet, even if you don't know whether you're going to have to process and review it all. You just throw a wide net and you preserve by making copies. And sort of the holy grail of e-discovery, in my view, has always been, can we get to a place where we don't have to make copies of things just to preserve them? Can we put holds on data and keep them in exactly where they're located on a server, but not need to make a copy of it because we can lock the files down and people won't be able to make changes to those files? Well, Office 365 presents that opportunity to you. Now, as I said before, it's only going to work for the data you've chosen to put into Office 365. Specifically, this applies to email and to SharePoint OneDrive. That's mainly what I'm talking about here. If you still allow people to save files on their personal devices, their computers, or in file shares in other locations, this is going to be of less utility to you. But you can use Office 365 to put a hold on somebody's mailbox and files in SharePoint and OneDrive that are relevant to a case. And that means you don't have to copy or export it. You can just put the hold in place, and it will save the data. And from the user standpoint, the user doesn't see any change, which means you can put in stealth holds if you want. If you suspect somebody of committing fraud on the company and you want to preserve their email but not necessarily tip them off that you're holding their stuff, you can put a hold on it, and the user won't know. The user can delete things out of their mailbox. It'll disappear from their view as if it's being deleted, but on the back end, so long as that hold is in place from the compliance center, from the e-discovery team, the data will still remain there, which is really nice. Microsoft has been updating its user interface for implementing these holds, and it's sort of has been a work in progress. Many companies I have found like to use a third-party product to help manage their holds in Office 365 because most companies don't have all their data solely in Office 365, and they need to have a meaningful way to track their efforts in all places, file shares and copying people's computers and cell phones and everything else. And so they use something like Legal Hold Pro, which is a web-based tool that can implement holds in Office 365 for you and also keep track of all your other activities. So that these are all advantages for the legal hold process for Office 365. And I'll transition now to Greg on the rest of this slide.
Thanks, Alan.
Before we get to Greg, sorry, Alan, with regard to the legal holds, really two questions for you. Are there any? So are you saying that right now the other applications that feed into Office 365, Ken listed the fact that earlier Office 365 is more than just email. It's also many of the other Microsoft applications like Word and Excel, OneDrive, SharePoint, things like that. Does legal hold functionality in Office 365 work with those environments or applications as well?
Some yes, and some no. And that is one of the sort of little hidden traps potentially for companies that they just need to be aware of. Microsoft is aware of this issue, and it's my sort of impression and understanding that they are working to make the legal hold and collection export process work for all of their applications across the Office 365 suite. But let me give you some examples. For example, if you have a Word or Excel document sitting in OneDrive or SharePoint, then you can put holds on it and you can export it. Great. You can also put holds and export data out of Skype. So if you have Skype messages, instant messaging that you're having your employees use, you can put a hold and export that. But Microsoft also has a product called Yammer. And Yammer is sort of a social media tool that you can implement within your company, and people can collaborate and form groups, kind of like Facebook or LinkedIn, but it's specific to your company. And people form groups and can collaborate using the tool and post comments and interesting articles and things like that. My understanding is that there's not currently a way to implement a legal hold or collect from Yammer using the same tools that you can use to put holds and export the other things from the other tools. So, there are some aspects of this that you're still going to have to do some e-discovery, what I would call workarounds, to collect data. But I believe it's Microsoft's intent and goal to unify all of their tools and eventually have them all operate and be subject to legal holds.
Thank you. Greg, how about some of the other functionality related to data searching?
Sure, and I think what Alan had alluded to, what he was just talking about there, is one of the best reasons for the people transition off to Microsoft, Office 365, in that this notion of what they call in-place e-discovery, where in the old days where stuff was on-prem and we had to collect the data, we would have to actually go out there, collect it, and then apply the searches to it. Whereas within Office 365, the searching can now occur with what they call in-place e-discovery. It can occur on the actual live mailboxes, on the actual live content out there, rather than having to collect it first, incurring the cost to do that collection, and then incurring the cost to do the searching offline. That's one of the best features that Office 365 has to offer from the legal e-discovery side of things, in my opinion. But when we do get into the searching of this stuff, there are some things to keep in mind. Office 365 searching in and of itself with the content search functions very well for what it does. But there are certain things in Office 365 that differ a little bit from e-discovery as we all know it. One of the things you have to keep in mind is right from the beginning of the search terms. When we apply search terms, in an e-discovery platform, we're used to applying search terms in a certain way with Boolean operators within two of a certain word or different terminology like that. Now within Office 365, those terminologies turn into near and different own near and certain terminology like that we need to know that when we're formulating these search terms, we need to use other operators so that it picks up the same type of search results that an e-discovery platform would. We also need to be aware that within Office 365, you get what you get when you export the data out of it. That meaning that there's nothing we can really do on the back end from a collection aspect of it to try to tweak it to export out more information from it. Whereas in an Exchange or an on-prem environment, there were certain things that we could do to try to export out other data types, or if there was an error, to try to work around those errors. It's limited in what you can do within 365 at this point. Also, once we get to that point of the searching, you got to remember too that there's limited searching attachment availability within Office 365. Not all attachments are able to be searched within the 365 environment. Mostly Microsoft-based attachments are ones that get searched when you apply within the content search different terms. So you have to be aware that there may be no OCR, there may be different attachment types that don't get searched within the content search. As long as you understand the functionality available within 365, the search works very well. But you also need to understand some of the limitations in what your expectations should be of the results that come out of that content search. And then when you're ready to export those results out, you need to be aware too that Microsoft does throttle export speed, meaning that if you're going to be exporting data out of 365 to put into a review tool, to process offline, whatever it may be, Microsoft does throttle that bandwidth speed. So if you're trying to do this export during peak hours during the day, they may throttle you and push you into the evening to be able to do the downloads. We've seen speeds where we're doing 15 or 20 gig downloads from Office 365 that may take 24 hours in order to do a download. That's different than when we're on-prem, when we go out there to do a collection. Usually in a couple of hours, we have our hands on the data and we're able to get moving with it. So we just need to understand that there are certain throttling and certain export limitations that come with the 365 platform.
Greg, what are some experiences that you've had with getting data out? Obviously, you talked a little bit about some of the throttling questions, but maybe describe the experiences that you tend to be engaged on as somebody's trying to collect data. What is some of your early questions, and what do you find are the common answers? And then how do you manage around that?
Sure, I can tell you the biggest thing that we get from a searching perspective from clients when they go out and perform searches within Office 365, the number one thing we get is what they call this unindexed items within Office 365. Anybody who's done a search within Office 365 will understand that there's a certain amount of data out there for some reason or another that does not get indexed within Office 365. So when you apply searches to the a user's mailbox or across their OneDrive, whatever it may be, when you go to export the results of that search, you'll always see something in there that says export unindexed items, and those sizes could be substantially large. Those are items that, if you include it within the export, should be processed through a standard e-discovery tool. I'm sure we've all encountered them as you've gone out there to do these exports, but unindexed items is probably the biggest thing that we get asked questions about.
And how about some of the other functionality that is involved with Office 365? I know with certain versions of licensing, we've talked about E3 and E5 a little bit. Those are different licensing options for businesses and users. There's some added functionality related to analytics and investigation functions. Greg, can you go through that a little bit as to what that functionality is?
Sure. Most users that we see and most companies that we see are typically on what they call an E3 license, which just incorporates into the the content searching, the ability to pull the data out of the system. Most people or organizations don't realize that those licenses on an as-needed basis can be upgraded to what they call E5 licenses, which is a higher level license that would allow you to then go in and apply Equivio analytics to the data right on the specific user's mailbox. And the thing to remember about that with the licensing issues are you don't need to leave these users in E5 licenses. What you can do is if you need to run analytics on a certain particular user's mailbox, you can escalate an E3 user up to an E5 user, do what you need to do, and then downgrade them back down to an E3 license. So you're not paying those costs on a monthly basis to keep all users into an E5 license, just in the event that you may need to apply analytics to it. You can do that on an as-needed basis.
Excellent. So I know a lot of the folks attending this webinar today are from corporate legal offices or maybe outside counsel. And one of the things I think that we have started to see is that Office 365 certainly has its challenges. It's an extremely powerful tool, and there may be some legal questions that come up with how users are using Office 365. Alan, I was actually wondering if you could walk us through what some of those questions or challenges could possibly be. I'm not saying that they are, but they could possibly be.
Yes, thanks. So, I would say over the last, more than a decade since the Zubilate cases, courts and lawyers have had quite a bit of time and experience to get comfortable, as much as you can be, with what I would call traditional e-discovery, and that is, going out and collecting email from on-premise servers and from file shares in people's computers, and sort of have gotten used to the processes and best practices surrounding that, how to identify problems, how to solve those problems, how to identify whether there was for example, intentional spoliation versus accidental spoliation, and working through those issues and knowing how the technology works, and experts feeling comfortable testifying to how things work. And now that things are moving to the cloud and we are exporting or handing off to somebody else, in this case Microsoft, the control of that data and the control of how the tool works, and sort of limiting ourselves in our ability to access that data in the same way, it presents the possibility, I think the likelihood, that there will come a day when there's going to be some hiccups in a case, some errors or hiccups or mistakes, and it's going to get challenged in court. And I don't think that judges are going to suddenly think that Office 365 is this sort of inappropriate newfangled technology that has no place in corporate environments, and that somehow companies should be punished for using it. I don't think that. I think there's analogies that can be used to explain to judges and other lawyers that will make sense if they're familiar with sort of basic old school e-discovery. But I think there are speed bumps and traps and sinkholes that we don't see yet, like any new technology. And I think there's a decent chance that there's going to be problems. And how you respond to them as a company and as a law department is important. I think it's been my experience that law departments are sort of surprised to realize that when IT decides to save costs, and there are considerable cost savings that you can have as a company by switching to Office 365, what that sometimes means is that there are going to be additional burdens and costs imposed on the law department. And that's often not captured in the cost-benefit analysis. when a company is deciding to switch. The law department may need to staff up. They may need to get a more experienced e-discovery professional working for them, and not rely on the existing personnel who has been managing their e-discovery process for them. Using Office 365 can enable the law department to do their own preservation and collection. They could rely less on IT, but they need to have the right people there. And what I mean by that specifically is there are errors that happen, error messages that you'll see when you are exporting a mailbox. And you need to have somebody experienced and savvy enough to know, is this an error that I need to be concerned about? Do I need to start over with this export, or can I ignore it? And the companies that I've seen, it's a learning curve. And there's some growing pains there of learning what to ignore and what to pay attention to. And one example would be one of my clients, whenever they see particular errors that the export's not working right, they've learned how to put in a command into Office 365 to have a person's mailbox physically moved from one server to the other. Microsoft allows you as a company to do that by running certain commands. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for sort of novices. But if you have somebody experienced that knows how to do this, you can tell Microsoft, I want this person's mailbox moved from server 1 to server 2. And when that happens, it re-indexes that person's mailbox. And the index reruns on that. It takes about 24 hours, typically. But once that's done, it usually cures a lot of the errors. And then you can export that person's mailbox then. But you need people that are paying attention to this and have a repeatable, documented process that they're going to follow, so that when you do end up in court because of some hiccup, you have the right person to testify as to what they did and the process they're following, and sort of what's doable and what's not.
I think, this is Sean, one of the things I've seen, obviously the federal rules of evidence were recently updated and started to acknowledge forensics tools as what we call self-authenticating evidence. Greg or Ken, I kind of pose this question to you. What does that mean? What is a self-authenticating evidence? And what is the difference between a forensics tool and maybe how Office 365 works?
Sure, this is Ken, and Greg, you can augment this as if you want to jump in at any point. But obviously, a self-authenticating tool is going to have some type of validation step in the process that indicates whether or not the export is done successfully, whether there are errors, and have some type of logging that would be able to validate the process. And again, I think one of the things that we have to pay attention to is we don't want to get lost in the fact that just because Microsoft's doing the work and the heavy lifting, that there's not still a responsibility from the organization to be able to ensure that this is done in a sound manner that is still defensible. And I'm sorry, what the second part of that question, Sean?
Well, what's the difference between how a forensics tool is used, something like FTK or NCASE that you and Greg have used a lot, and how maybe Office 365 is being used to do collection of data, whether it's email or maybe other data sources?
Sure. Again, I think it really comes down to the nuances of how the tool works and building the defensibility process around understanding the mechanisms and the reporting. Again, you still want to have some type of documentation around the effort, and as Alan mentioned earlier, it has to be reproducible, and it has to be you want it to be a standard, so that when again you're articulating it to somebody at the courts or the opposing side, that it's well understood, and it's something that anybody else would be able to do with the like system. But in saying that, again, there with these, I guess the something that I could equate it to is doing a copy in Windows when you're just dragging and dropping files. There's certain alterations that might be made that may or may not be seen by to people running the process, where a forensics expert would be able to look at that data and be able to tell whether or not it was forensically sound. Where again, a true forensic expert is going to employ a process that ensures that that data is going to be pristine.
And Ken, this is Greg. The only thing I would add to that is, typically when we use an NCASE or an FTK to go out and do a collection, those tools are meant for collection, meaning that they have the logging behind them, as you said. They have what they call hash values associated with certain things that have been collected. When you produce, and we do a lot of stuff where we produce to an opposing side, in a matter where we're able to produce that, when the other side gets it, they're able to fully verify those images and those collections that we've sent to them. So there is some sort of way to authenticate a lot of that stuff. Office 365 isn't meant to be, I guess, that kind of forensic collection type tool. So when you do an export out of Office 365, you really do have to pay attention to some of the logs that are associated with, the content search and the export and what gets exported out, what may not have gotten exported out, just to call attention to those, because it's not as self-authenticating, so to speak, as an FTK image or an NCASE image may be when we do provide that to an opposing expert.
Greg, one of the questions that came into the chat while you guys were talking, if I could just insert it here because it seems appropriate, does Office 365 generate automatic logs of what was collected, how it was collected? I was wondering if you can just answer that briefly.
Yep, it does generate logs as to what was collected, what was aired out. So there will be a pretty extensive log that gets, again, let me phrase that by saying first, it depends on how you do it. But if you run a content search and do an export out from the content search, there are logs that get exported out within that so that you could see, what error files may have happened, what didn't get downloaded. That said, there's really not much you can do to then go in and collect those problematic files that may not have been downloaded. That's one of the things that differs a little bit from an Office 365 type solution to an on-prem type solution, where we may have had some other options as to how to go in and collect those problematic files with on-prem solutions.
Great, thank you. So we're nearing towards the end, and I think there's some key takeaways that everybody can sort of consider. As I mentioned before, I think a lot of our clients here are either inside counsel, general counsel, or outside counsel. And I think there's some very important aspects that each group distinctly can walk away with. One of the first things is to educate yourself about Office 365. If you're general counsel, assistant general counsel, you're in-house legal of some sort, I would strongly encourage you to walk down the hallway to your IT director and ask a very basic question. Are we using Office 365? And if the answer to that question is yes, I would spend some time talking to them a little bit more about how it's implemented, what are some of the settings, all those things that we sort of covered throughout this presentation and more. If you're outside counsel, there's a great opportunity for you to do some consulting work for your longstanding clients, if you will, on information governance and helping them to determine whether they need to be better prepared for a discovery response or a government investigation because they're using Office 365. Really, education is going to be your primary takeaway in all of this. The second major takeaway would be building a process around the Office 365 collection aspect. So making sure you've identified as a business who is doing the collection work, who's implementing a legal hold, what types of searches or what type of culling and filtering can be applied, and what should the results ultimately look like? What is your validation process? As we've seen with a number of e-discovery challenges surrounding spoliation, one of the main things that drive whether somebody is considered negligent in their discovery obligations is whether they have a built-in process. If you have a built-in process, you have less of a legal concern that you're trying to spoil data or hide something. Obviously, things happen outside of our control, and I think the courts have reflected the fact that that is understood. But when a company doesn't take into account its email management system and doesn't bother to educate itself on what the options are, a lot of the things that Alan raised as to the what are the data retention policies in place, for example, then it's very hard for a court to say that anybody's taken their compliance or discovery obligation seriously. And if that legal challenge comes up, you may actually be found to have spoiled data, and obviously a negative impact such as an adverse inference or other such sanctions could be in effect. So make sure that there's a process in place in managing Office 365 and getting data out of Office 365. And finally, what I would recommend, a lot of times, I think, Greg, you alluded to this before, we get asked a question sort of last minute. I need to get something out right away in response to a discovery request or a government subpoena. And so we scramble trying to learn about their environment as quickly as we can. And it actually adds more time. It adds more cost. Having an e-discovery or forensics or Office 365 consultant already engaged doesn't mean they have to be doing work constantly, but somebody that is familiar with your environment puts you in a better position to deal with Office 365 tasks and issues than waiting for that discovery request or government subpoena to come across your desk. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for a couple of questions, and we did receive them in the chat as the presentation was going on. Maybe the first one I'll direct to Alan. When we hear that opposing counsel is using Office 365, are there any questions that we should ask or maybe even depose in a 30B6 deposition about their discovery methods?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that comes to mind is there's a couple of there's a fork in the road decision that a company can make right at the beginning of when they decide to start exporting documents from Office 365. And I'm going to assume for this purpose that they put an in-hold place on the data. You know, if you were to depose somebody, you'd want to ask them, did you place a legal hold on the data? Did you make sure that, when did that legal hold get put on place and that type of thing to make sure that preservation happens. But I think where the fork in the road is for somebody in a company is, did you export the entire mailbox and data, or did you rely on a search? Traditionally, when it comes to preservation efforts, e-discovery people sort of have considered best practice that you copy everything, or at least nearly everything. Maybe you do a date filter, but you don't do a lot of search term limiting when it comes to collection. Usually the search terms come in further down the work stream once the data has been loaded into relativity, let's say, and then you can do searches there. But you can in Office 365, you could choose instead of collecting an entire mailbox, you could run search terms and just say, well, I only want to collect things that contain the word blue and box and table, right? And that's going to limit what is even outputted from Office 365 in that export. Most of the companies I've been working with, because of sort of traditional best practices, they export entire mailboxes, and however long that takes, that's what it takes. And then they send entire mailboxes to an outside vendor to load up into relativity and process and dedupe and everything else. And so if I were to ask questions, I would start with, how are you doing your exports? Are you exporting mailboxes entirely, or are you putting limitations on it because we want to know what's being left behind?
Great, thank you. Maybe Greg or Ken, one of the questions that came in actually relates to GDPR, and obviously that's a very timely question with some of the changes that are going to be in effect in May. So how can Office 365 users comply with GDPR requirements? Is using something like a geotenant or some other option in place? I'm sorry, is using something like a geotenant an option that can be put in place?
Sean, this is Ken. I think that, again, with GDPR around the corner, I mean, there's going to be, a lot that has to be done through the IT infrastructure to understand, again, what policies and procedures are in place, regarding the storage of that data and in relation to that process. So I don't know if there's a clear answer at the moment on how to ensure compliance, but I know that that again the geography of the provenance of the data will be important in ensuring that the jurisdiction is taken into consideration with compliance.
Yeah, I think one of the things maybe to point out to our attendees here is that the cloud is not this one amorphous unit, that the cloud is actually made up of various locations. And I think to your point, Ken, whatever location that data is being stored, there's almost a series of clouds throughout the world that Microsoft supports currently, including in each of the continental regions, and potentially having the appropriate data stored at the appropriate cloud is really one of the ways you can ensure some GDPR compliance. But obviously, it's a much broader question. Thank you for the answer. I know we're a little over and sort of out of time, and I want to be respectful of everybody's everybody's participation. I want to thank everybody for participating on the panelist team. I'd like to thank all of the attendees that have attended. We hope at RVM and at Actium that you have found the presentation to be informational and relevant to any of the interests and concerns you have. Feel free to reach out